that period, and particularly in the Peak District area. So why cotton? Why are we focusing on cotton? Cotton is one of the best examples of a global commodity. This is something that's come out of academic scholarship, talking about it as really key in leading to all kinds of global trade connections, developments in commerce, developments in transnational networks, developments in various forms of economics. So from an academic point of view, cotton is a really obvious place to think about global connections, and particularly those connections between India and Britain. From a less academic point of view, I think it's pretty apparent how cotton shapes our lives, how many of the clothes that we're still wearing today are made of cotton, and we're aware through new activism around sweatshop labour and kinds of things about some of the potentially exploitative dimensions of cotton production and cotton use. So that's why we're thinking about cotton. So a bit of background about cotton. It's got an ancient history in India. Archaeologists have found cotton cloth fragments in India dating back to 5,000 years. It's got a very, very long history, and it seems that India was the place where cotton fabric production first really developed. Over that 5,000 year period, it's spread. So you can see from the yellow line, that's kind of cultivated before 3000 BC. Cotton spread from the Indian subcontinent west towards the Middle East. Different types of cotton. Each of the colours represent a different kind of cotton. I'm not an expert agriculturally, but they are different kinds of cotton spread to all the parts of the world where we now associate cotton growing with, so India and the Americas primarily. Egypt, Egyptian cotton is what is fashionable to talk about, but that's coming again from India. And cotton has been grown more recently, but by more recently I mean the last 1,000 years, all over the Indian subcontinent, but particularly in Gujarat, the Coromandel coast and Bengal. And this is for a number of reasons, but mainly because these areas had strong ports, thriving merchant communities, and also because Bengal was a fertile delta, which made it famous for a particular kind of cotton due to its rich soil. Over that 1,000-year period, so that time from 1200 to 800 AD, Indian cotton and Indian cotton fabrics, so the cloth made out of Indian cotton, developed this really global reach. So what the Tudors wore or Tudor period people wore when they used cotton, primarily they used wool, but when they used cotton it was all from India. Indian calicos were very much associated with ideas about restoration fashion. It was very prized. And this was because of its lightness. It was much lighter than the woolen garments that we used in Britain. It was also had much better dyes, used with indigo, again from India, and also because of the patterning of it. So in Britain, in the kind of early modern period, patterns were put onto fabric by weaving. So different wool threads were woven through to create a rug, to create a pattern. What was happening in India was that there was some of that weaving, but what they also developed was a way of printing pattern onto fabric. So completing the fabric, then putting on the patterns, and this enabled it to be much more intricate and different designs. So it was very fashionable in Britain. One of the other reasons why Indian cotton fabric was so successful at capturing this global market was that the weavers and the artisans and the merchants were very successful at marketing different patterns to different places. So when they sold it to Mozambique, places on the Indian Ocean, they used a lot of red colours, blue colours, very strong patterns. But this is a classic example of the kinds of pattern they created for an English audience. So it's classically marketed for Britain because of the floral design and because of it being a pattern printed on a white background. That was the fashionable way to do it in Britain in the 18th century. So this is a hanging which is illustrative of those examples. Now, as you'll have noticed from the title of the presentation that I'm giving about cotton and colonialism, part of what happens is that the Indian production, the production of cloth and of cotton, becomes increasingly bound up with colonial processes. And the main organisation responsible for these changes is the East India Company. So the East India Company, it's a private company that's developed in about 1600, kind of Elizabethan company, but it really picks up about a century later. It's a trading company, it's to do with merchants, it's about trading cotton, of course, but also indigo, spices. And what happens from about the 1700s onwards is that this commercial company does two things. Firstly, it increasingly becomes linked with the British government. It needs a charter, and the East India Company's actions in India become increasingly linked with British actions in India. And the second thing is that it develops an army. So as you can see from the picture of people as the soldiers, this is just an illustration from the time, but it becomes a fighting force. So it enforces its economic power through violence and through military force. And the East India Company very quickly realised that Indian cotton is going to be a very profitable thing to focus on. A quotation from a British person writing to Bombay in the 17th century, he says, "The making of calicos is that in which the people of India are most apt, and a commodity which is most vendible to Europe." So they recognise that the skillful artisanal labour in India might be a very good money maker. And of course they want to make money themselves. They don't want the money to go to the artisans. It becomes part of a thoroughly colonial process. And I'm not going to give you too much information about this because this is what I work on, this changing colonial relationship, and I realise that we're just here for a little while to talk about this. But over the kind of the last 300 or 400 years, Britain's relationship with India becomes increasingly exploitative, mainly driven through this East India Company. It establishes its army. At the Battle of Plassey, it conquers Bengal, then Punjab, and this kind of war kind of increases until 1857, when you get the Indian Rebellion, sometimes called the Indian Mutiny, sometimes called the First War of Indian Independence, which is a point at which that rule is threatened. And one of the outcomes of the mutiny is that the East India Company, so that private company, loses its power. It has to be taken over by the British government. And the British government turn it into the Raj. So this is where we're getting the term Raj from. It comes into use at this period when it shifts from East India power to British government power. And so this isn't just happening in India, it's part of a global process of colonisation. And as you can see from the map, the areas coloured pink or red, it's a very typical way of representing the British Empire as India becomes incorporated into this global enterprise. And you can see that even in very ornate maps like this, which is clearly, it's a political map, they're trying to make a political purpose about dominance, subordination, grandeur, wealth, status. Even in this kind of map, what the map is actually illustrating is trade routes. And you can see that through the arrows, and if you look at all the trade routes that go from India to Britain, a lot of them are cotton-based. That's what's going on. Now, the effect of colonialism and these developments on the Indian cotton industry are very, very problematic. Really what happens is the British try to corner the market for the production of fabrics, and kind of deindustrialize the Indian economy so that the Indian economy becomes reorientated around the production of the raw material, so the cotton itself, and it's then taken back to Britain, turned into fabric, and then sold back to India at a higher price. So this is kind of classic colonial economy, which was devastating. And the reason they're able to do that is because in this period, in areas like the Peak District, areas in Britain, you go through the Industrial Revolution, which completely changes the way cotton is produced. And in just a second, I'm going to pass over to Daniel, who's going to talk you through that bit of the history. But what I wanted to point out was that although all this happens, it doesn't mean the cloth stops being produced in India. So when we talk about this story, at one level, the main thing to take away is that the Indian economy is deindustrialized and that it focuses on the production, but it does continue in various forms. And this itself was seen as a continued source of fascination to the British. And what this final illustration is it's of 4 Indian cotton workers who are weavers. They're weaving rugs like that one in the front of the picture, who were actually brought over in 1886 to the Great Exhibition, or to the 1886 Indian Colonial Exhibition more specifically, to demonstrate that skill. So cotton continued to be very much linked with India, and that was where some of the value of it came from.
Okay.
So Daniel will now talk about the Industrial Revolution.
Thank you very much.
While Daniel does that, does anyone have any questions?
Yes, could I just start?
Yes.
Right at the end of your talk there, you were saying about cotton still being produced in India. Would it be the case that the sort of cheap cotton for ordinary working people was produced in England, and what they were produced in India was the more luxury goods?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So what the cotton is being spun in India.
Yeah.
The fabrics are being woven in Britain through these developments. So it's that kind of difference between spinning and cloth making, essentially. But some cloth making does continue in India.
Yeah.
But what the East India Company are very effective at thwarting is the international market for that cloth. So cloth is still produced, but it can't be sold globally.
Right.
Because the East India Company makes a monopoly of selling the finished cloth globally.
So what's
cloth
produced
is
in
still
India
made
tends to stay
in
in
India.
India.
Yeah, to sell in India.
One more point I wanted to clarify is when the East India Company first came to India, during our reading of history, because I come from India, it was called the East India Tea Company. It came with the sole purpose of making money from tea.
Yes.
And the cotton was the byproduct which was found that it can make money for that. It's just a point which I thought.
No, you're right. I should have mentioned tea. Yes, tea as well. Yeah, tea, spices.
Because they stole the plants from China to bring over to India and the same plant.
And opium too.
And also they traded the tea for the opium and
It's to give to the Chinese to get them addicted to opium, so they would do as they were told. 45 million junkies.
Actually, India is a gold mine. So basically, the East India Company started with for the spices, and gradually they got that access to the mine, and they discovered and they developed, and so many things. The company flourished, and they invited that not only the British, that other European companies as well. So it is not only the British monopoly anyway. So we are not going to the East India Company anymore. We are thinking about cotton.
Sure.
So it started with spices.
Yeah.
To discover the land. So many people that tried. And anyway,
I think I just realised that all these products were just so valuable.
But it started with spices.
Spices.
Because they figured out the Romans gave them. Herodotus wrote a book, a Greek writer, but they also had in Herodotus' story of the Romans going to India and buying cloth. And the cloth age you have for the cloth is 10,000 years old, it's not 5. It's a place in India called Mohenjo-Daro.
Yes.
wow.
And they found fabrics of cloth there that are 10 to 12,500 years old.
Oh, wow.
Way older than what
Even
you're
older.
expressing.
Wow.
Mind you, they've also found flushing toilets in these buildings in Mohenjo-Daro. So the manufacture of cloth is a lot older than what you've actually recognised, to be honest.
Wow. I can believe it. I can believe it. Yeah.
Actually, the Dutch company have got that monopoly over the Indian that products and there are so many things, the resources, that as in to break their monopoly, that company was formed, and that is the pre-East India Company.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll come back.